afternoon. My name is Julia Lane, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for Data and Computing. And I'm delighted to welcome everyone to our Winter Distinguished Speaker Series. To start with some opening remarks, I'd like to introduce Nick Feamster, who is the Faculty Director of the Center for Data and Computing and the Neubauer Professor of Computer Science at the University of Chicago.
Thanks, Julia. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to today's distinguished lecture at the Center for Data and Computing. I'll spend just less than a minute talking about the mission of our center, which is to be an intellectual hub and an incubator for data science and artificial intelligence research across the university and across campus. So the center is just over 2 years old now. And is really part of a much broader university-wide initiative to chart a new intellectual direction for data science scholarship, both at the university and globally, I would say. I think the university has a long tradition of doing work and research that defines new fields. And I'm excited to be a part of CDAC and have the privilege of leading the center as the university continues to blaze new trails in this new exciting area of scholarship. I think another thing I'll just mention briefly is that a big hallmark of the center is that the data science work that we do is interdisciplinary. And that's a big focus of our talk series as well. You'll see that the talks that we have, including today's, really have an intersection with society. But more broadly, the center aims to support all kinds of interdisciplinary, high-risk, high-reward kinds of projects in this area. And I think it's worth mentioning that we support projects in pretty much every academic unit on campus, just about all of them, from the social sciences to the natural sciences. So you can learn more on our website. Today, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Professor Olga Russakovsky, who is an assistant professor in the computer science department at Princeton, but already quite distinguished. Olga received her PhD from Stanford, where she did some incredibly groundbreaking work, among which include some of the work to build a system called ImageNet, which has become just far and away the basis for a lot of machine learning and computer vision research in the area. And I think for me, as someone outside the domain of vision, but who's someone who thinks about benchmarks in machine learning and AI, this is just absolutely the gold standard for what a benchmark should be, and the types of impact that it's had on the community are incredibly inspirational. Olga has received a number of awards. You have her bio, so I won't read them all, but among them include the Tech Review's 35 Under 35 award. She received that a few years ago, and not very many people get that. And I think one of the things that's so impressive about that one too is that it focuses not only on the technology, but on technology that really changes the world in positive ways. And I think Olga has been doing a lot of that. And then finally, one final thing I'll say about Olga's career pursuits is she helped found an organization called AI for All, which is dedicated to increasing diversity and inclusion in artificial intelligence. It started at Stanford. There's now many stars in the constellation. It's a large and successful nonprofit organization. And I remember when I first heard Olga talk about it, and she said, AI is going to change the world, but who's going to change AI? And I thought, this doesn't make any sense to me. Like, why are we talking about AI? Why are we talking about computer science? Computer science has a diversity problem too. And it took me probably a few years to really understand really the depth of the challenge that AI and machine learning faces with fairness and diversity. And here we are now with a distinguished speaker series on this topic. And so we're fortunate to have Olga come to talk to us about her technical work in this area of fairness and computer vision. and how to build systems that bring that consider these practical constraints. But I think it's important to note that Olga has also done really important outreach in this area. Olga is also a former colleague of mine, so it's my distinct pleasure to welcome her back to Chicago. She's in Princeton, we're in Chicago, but it's great to have you here, and I couldn't be more thrilled to have you. I think there's maybe one more slide where I'm supposed to do a little bit of advertising for the center. Is that true? Oh, there is not. Okay, good. So I think without further ado, I'll kick it back over to you, Olga, and the rest of the hour is yours. We're very, very excited.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for having me and for the very generous introduction here. Let's see. So I'm going to play this, and then I'm going to make sure I can see the chat. Okay. Excellent. So hello, everybody. I wish I could see you, but hello to everybody in virtual land. So we'll talk today about fairness in visual recognition. So a few years ago, sort of these topics around bias and fairness and a misrepresentation in AI systems, and particularly in computer vision, has started to be a kind of a topic of conversation both among researchers, but also in the public eye. So there was, for example, a photo processing app that managed to build a filter for increasing the attractiveness of a photo. Now, why they wanted to do that in the first place is beyond me, but the much bigger issue perhaps is that this filter was a computer vision model that learned to increase attractiveness by manipulating skin color. There were observations that machines taught by photos learned a sexist view of women. There was fact covered in the New York Times that facial recognition technology is accurate, but only for white men. And there's very deep structural issues that go into these systems, and deep structural concerns that sort of arise as a result of these kinds of this kind of behavior by AI systems. And there's an excellent book by my colleague at Princeton, Professor Ruha Benjamin, that just came out, Race After Technology, that really dives into these causes and reasons and outcomes. But for the purposes of this talk, I will simplify this down very substantially. So I highly recommend her book if you want to kind of dive deeper into this. But for the purposes of this talk, we'll just have this sort of simple cycle where the human history, bias, and prejudice in some way influences the large-scale data. So the data that we collect is reflective of our society, which then becomes learned by our AI models and go on to make decisions in the world, and that ends up affecting our society. And so this is the cycle that we're looking at, and the question that I want to ask as a AI researcher, as a computer vision engineer, is can we adjust the AI design to help mitigate some of these effects? And I think entirely removing them is not going to be possible, or at least I'm not convinced that would be possible, but we can at least take steps towards mitigating them. So let's first look at the data part. And so on the data side, the most critical thing to realize is that large-scale data does not mean that there is fair representation. And there's a number of works that show this, right? So there's the work by Joy Blomwini and Tamid Gebru, actually the same one that was covered in the Times that I already mentioned, that showing that there is a distinct lack of race diversity in face data sets. So this is part of what affects the accuracy of downstream face recognition technology. There's other works that show that there's a lack of geographic diversity in these large-scale image data sets, particularly in ImageNet, but also open images. And you would think that this geographic diversity is only an issue insofar as it leads to sort of underrepresentation of certain demographics of people. But there's been other works since then that show that this is not just the case for representation of people, but for example, representation of different objects. So we're building, technology that's sort of seemingly very innocuous for object recognition. But in practice, what happens is if you have a data set that's very focused on a particular geographic region, you're going to learn a very geographic specific view of objects. So one of the examples they give is you're training an object classifier to recognize soap, right? Seems very innocuous. What the classifier actually learns is US brands of liquid soap, which means that they then fail on soap in any other country. And all of this stems, at least in part, from the fact that we collect data from search engines, because search engines are the cheapest and simplest source of data. And search engines tend to reveal almost, by construction, the most salient, the most likely to be clicked on images related to a particular concept rather than a diversity of images. Another excellent book that I'll highlight by Safiya Noble called Algorithms of Oppression that dives into, again, the structural reasons behind the search engines' behavior, as well as the harms that causes in terms of representation of different people. But inspired by all of these kinds of works, we realized that kind of the key place where we can contribute is around creating transparency into large-scale computer vision data sets. So given that all of these factors are at play, what can we do in terms of making sure that researchers at least understand what is in their data after they've collected this millions of images or hundreds of millions of images of data? And so together with my student, Angelina Wang, and collaborator, Professor Arvind Narayanan, we built this tool, which is called Revise. So this is revealing visual biases. And it takes as an input a visual data set and its annotations and outputs a set of metrics. So trying to produce insights as well as possible actions for folks who are working with these data sets. And so the key contributions are the following. So it provides transparency into large-scale data set. That's our key goal here. It aids data set creators and users. So fairness ultimately will require manual interventions and will require people to make some kind of decisions about what visual patterns and visual statistics are okay in the data set and which pose a problem and they will want to sort of do something about that. And so this tool is meant to surface a set of statistics and sort of kick it back to the user or to the dataset creator to do something about it and to determine which ones are potentially harmful. So this tool, which by the way, I should say it's a series of Python notebooks for now, and it's publicly available if you want to play with it. So it leverages both the available annotations, so any kind of manual annotations you have, but the data set is happy to take in, as well as existing pre-trained models, as well as train some simple models on the data as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And the key thing is it goes beyond just noting underrepresentation to actually trying to analyze differences in portrayal of different objects and genders and geographic regions for now, but we're working on expanding it to different racial groups as well. So I'll just give you a few kind of examples of the kinds of statistics that Revise can surface in a data set, as well as sort of some possible actions for what to do with that. So the first thing is looking at the context and images that depict males and females. And to be clear here, so when I say males and females, so these are gender annotations of binarized, socially perceived gender expression, which are derived from image captions. So almost certainly these annotations are not correct on an individual level. There are mistakes for sure in these annotations, but on the whole, when you look at the aggregate statistics, it still paints an informative picture about the data set. So the first bit of analysis, we're correlating the presence of different genders in COCO, which is a popular visual recognition data set, with objects, where for objects, we're using ground truth object annotations that are grouped manually into super categories like sports objects, vehicles, outdoor objects, animals, and so on. And so on the x-axis, we're showing the fraction of images that contain this category. And we can see that, for example, for sports objects, there's an overrepresentation of males. For kitchen objects, there's an overrepresentation of females. And so this is an example of the kind of graph that Revise would produce, and then it's sort of up to the dataset creator to decide if this is something that needs to be intervened upon. Similarly, we can look at, for example, scene categories. And scene categories, there's no existing annotations within COCO, so we can use the pre-trained network, pre-trained on the places data set of scene categories that's publicly available. And so here again, we can look at different scenes and the fraction of images within the scene that contain male or female. And so we can see, okay, so outdoor sports fields and parks have an overrepresentation of males, shopping and dining, overrepresentation of females. So they said, right, the actionable insight then would be to go out and collect images of the underrepresented gender with the corresponding objects and scenes if warranted. So going a little bit deeper beyond just these kinds of statistics, we can look at interaction between objects and people of different genders. And so here for the analysis, we're using the person-object distance as a proxy for interaction because we don't have interaction annotations, but we can say, for example, here's an object organ The top images contain likely female, the bottom likely males, and we can measure the distance between these. And so this relies on having access to these bounding boxes annotated within COCO. We can measure the distance and we can observe that females tend to be further away from this object, males tend to be closer. And so we can infer that it's likely that the males are more often actually playing the org and are kind of interacting with it, whereas females may occur in the images but are not actually interacting with it. So the actionable insight, right, again, is, can consider equalizing the level of interaction with the object if this is warranted for this particular case. And finally, as promised, so the differences in portrayal of different genders. So here for the analysis is for each object class, we can learn visual classifiers for recognizing this object when it's present with females versus present with males in images. And so because we're only training the models on the positive examples, it's actually manageable to do this. It doesn't require crazy amounts of computational power. And then we identify classes with the most stark differences between genders. And so, for example, two of the objects that we've serviced were sports uniforms and flowers. They appear with both genders, but as you can see, the kind of representation is very different between the genders in terms of images that depict this object. And again, the actionable insight would be to collect more images of each gender with a particular object in more diverse situations, if warranted. And so this was kind of a quick overview of Revise, but going back to the general outline, sort of some of the higher order takeaways is that when it comes to working with large scale data, we need targeted efforts to first both increase representation and try to target some of the underlying issues for the data sets being the way they are, but also be able to examine and understand the data and constructively engage with these issues, right? So right now, what we know how to do is train models on large scale data sets. This is likely the reality, at least for now. So then, how do we collect data at this scale, but try to make it a little bit more representative and do it a little bit more responsibly. So I only talked about the bottom work here. I didn't get to talk about the top one that I'm citing, which is on, it was sort of the precursor to Revise. It was looking at ImageNet in particular as an example of a data set that for a variety of historical reasons had both some issues with the labels that were used there, as well as the demographics of the people that were represented were quite skewed. And so this paper sort of tries to look into this one particular data set and do some analysis and do some mitigation of biases. And then Revise kind of came out as what if we do this generally for all data sets? But of course, unfortunately, as I've already mentioned, there's always going to be bias in the data. It's not going to be possible to construct. It's not even clear what a completely debiased data set looks like. And there's always this tension between, do we want the data to capture the current state of the world? Do we want the data to capture an ideal state of the world? If we wanted to capture the current state of the world, how do we define that? Is that the US world, which is part of what the data sets are doing now? Is it really the world? So there's all kinds of questions there. And so ultimately, a lot of the focus and the responsibility will fall onto the AI models as well. Is given a large-scale data set with potential problems, what can we do to when we're actually training on this data to make it better? And so I'll actually jump in here before diving into the technical details. I'll actually give you some of the sort of takeaways up front and some of the kinds of things that we're using to guide our work. Which is, first of all, that so fairness research presents unique challenges in visual recognition in particular. And one of the key reasons why is because when we're working with images, the low-level input is in the form of pixels, right? And each pixel is inherently completely uninformative, right? It's only through the rich structural connections between them that an image becomes useful and informative and understandable to us. And so in contrast to areas like text analysis and sort of bias in text data, to sort of doing fairness or bias with tabular data, for example, for criminal risk prediction and so forth. Here, there's unique challenges in terms of like, how do you go back down to the feature level and make any kind of sense of them? So if you're talking about, gender bias, what pixels actually contribute to that? Sort of where are the gender cues coming from in the images? So there's all kinds of interesting questions around that. Second, there's opportunities to both adapt some existing techniques, for example, around like long tail distribution training and things like that, as well as innovate on them in this particular context of fairness. And finally, there's delicate trade-offs between accuracy and fairness, and lots of opportunities to think about how should you measure fairness and how do you define new fairness metrics and what does that mean? And so with that, I will dive into a particular line of work that looks at a very particular problem within this space. And the problem is going to be the following. So we're going to be teaching a classifier to ignore a known spurious correlation in the data. So our training set is going to have a skewed distribution. So for example, our target class that we're trying to predict from the images is correlated with a protected attribute like gender or race. So for example, you're trying to classify images by the activity that the person in the image is performing, but the activity that the person is doing is correlated with their gender. And at test time, there's, again, a variety of metrics, but let's say for simplicity, our goal is to classify images while ignoring this undesirable correlation. So for example, might say that, we're trying to classify both pictures of women and pictures of men into what activity they're doing, sort of with similar high accuracy. However, I don't want to spend this whole talk showing, examples of gender stereotypes or racial stereotypes. So I'm actually going to use a running, very innocuous example here, which is I'm going to say, suppose we're trying to train a classifier to detect whether somebody is wearing a hat or not. We'll still be working with face images, but at least we're not going to be focusing on gender or race stereotypes. So you're trying to train a classifier for classifying hat images, and hat in your data set is correlated with glasses. You could imagine hats are frequently worn outside, and then people might also put on sunglasses. So that's the correlation. So here I'm also putting a yellow border around all of the images with sunglasses just to make it a little bit easier to track sort of what's going on and where this bias is. And then at test time, we are going to be classifying images into hat or not hat, where hat is actually not correlated with glasses in the test data. All right. So what's the simplest thing? Okay, we can throw it at what we're going to call a baseline classifier, which is basically a CNN with a classifier for this. So in this case, it would be a binary classifier, hat or no hat. And so this baseline may very likely learn this undesirable correlation. Why? Because it's going to learn the most discriminative feature or subset of features in the training data set. There's sort of nothing in the loss function, nothing in subjective that would tell it, okay, I don't want you to learn about sunglasses. It just says, okay, here's some positive images, here's some negative images. Just go ahead and learn. Go ahead and learn a model from this to distinguish positives from negatives. So what are some things you can do to try to mitigate it? So probably the simplest, right, is you can do over or under sampling, where essentially in the top we have this, this one image of a person wearing a hat but not sunglasses. Okay, so you can, replicate it enough times, or you can reweigh it such that the balance of sunglasses versus no sunglasses becomes the same. And similarly, in the bottom row, we will replicate the image of somebody wearing sunglasses as many times as it takes. So this works very well in some cases and very poorly in others. And essentially, so undersampling, right, ultimately discards data. Ultimately, I don't think that undersampling will ever be the answer because, again, if you have this data, the trick is figuring out what is the right way to make use of it. And I think discarding it entirely is almost certainly not the answer. Oversampling or reweighting is okay in theory, but it's prone to both overfitting as well as numerical instability in practice when you're actually training with these models. So the second option that's commonly proposed in the literature is called adversarial debiasing, where essentially you're trying to train a model that's able with some kind of underlying feature representation that's able to classify the target class. So this purple target classifier is classifying hats versus non-hats. It's similar to the baseline classifier, but not be able to correctly classify the protected attribute. And so make sure that these features are not good enough to discriminate between the protected attribute. And this is commonly proposed in the literature. And I'm not going to, we present a lot of sort of insights and analysis of this in the paper. But without diving into the details, I mean, even just looking at these examples, right, the left and the right problems seem very similar. So when there's a strong correlation, it's very tricky to, train a representation that can do one, but then explicitly not be able to do the other. Also, CNNs, even like a pre-trained CNN that's trained on some other task that has nothing to do with this, tend to be very powerful. They produce very powerful representations. And so, a linear classifier can be trained on top of these representations to do sort of many of the tasks that you would throw at it quite well. And so sort of trying to harm this representation to not be able to do a particular task typically harms it enough that it then is not able to do your target task as well. So that's kind of the intuition there. So this turns out to not work very well in practice. So what turns out to work quite well, actually, and better than either of the previous two methods, is what we're calling domain-independent training. And this takes inspiration from the literature on sort of fairness through awareness in the ML fairness community, which essentially says, like, yes, there is this correlation. There are these two domains, or these two values of the protected attributes. So there's with glasses, without glasses. Okay, so we're going to train two independent classifiers. So this is, you can think of this as kind of training a conditional model. So given that this is a picture of somebody with glasses, we're going to use it to train the left blue classifier. Given that this is a picture of somebody without glasses, we're going to use it to train this right red classifier. And at test time, of course, you don't know which one it is. So you can do something simple like summing the decision boundaries, so sort of summing the scores of the two classifiers, which, because they're sharing an underlying feature representation and are linear classifiers on top of it, this is essentially the same as summing the decision boundaries. So this works very well. Especially, this will become relevant a little bit later, especially in settings with high skew. So where there's high correlation between the target and protected attribute, this tends to work very well. These are the kinds of settings that where oversampling really starts running into issues. And the baseline, of course, starts running into issues because it almost inevitably will learn these features. But this kind of separate sort of domain independent training works very well. So we've seen these findings hold across a variety of settings. So this is, the first setting, CFAR grayscale. So this is kind of a synthetic data set that we made up, where it's CFAR, it's a 10-way object classification data set, and we essentially injected an artificial correlation with whether the image appears in color or grayscale, and this is correlated with the object class. And we're evaluating mean per class per attribute accuracy. So essentially, removing the correlation at test time this way. And so you can see, right, so baseline, adversarial performs much worse than the baseline. Domain independent performs much better. In this case, oversampling performs slightly better than the baseline, but not as good as domain independent. Then CFAR ImageNet is similar, except instead of artificially injecting color or grayscale, we're actually adding, we're swapping out some images from CFAR for images of the same class from ImageNet, so sort of a more subtle domain shift. So here, actually, oversampling, so speaking of these like instability issues with oversampling, so here oversampling does worse, while the others follow the same pattern. And then CELEB-A, which is a data set that we'll talk about in the context of the next paper as well. So this is multi-label face attribute recognition. The protected attribute is actually gender. And so the evaluation here is weighted mean average precision weighted, basically the weighting being used to decorrelate the two genders for the attributes. And so here, interestingly enough, I mean, again, adversarial performance worse than baseline, domain independent performs better, but here actually oversampling ends up performing better. And so all of this inspired us to ask the next question, which is, can we actually go ahead and generate the data that we need? Right. So, rather than oversampling, can we actually generate a decorrelated data set? So in the real world data, right, hat is correlated with glasses. Could we do some kind of paired augmentation where, if we have an image of a hat with glasses, we go ahead and remove the glasses. If we have an image with no hat and no glasses, we go ahead and add glasses. And so we create these kind of paired samples that can then be used to train a classifier the same way, but now it's not going to learn the correlation because there's no correlation in the data. And so in order to do this, right, so what do we turn to? I mean, these are image data. So of course we turn to GANs, to generative adversarial networks that essentially learn a latent space and a mapping from this latent space to realistic looking images. And so we can have this GAN trained on a real world data set. And along the way, we also need a glasses classifier that's trained on real world data, right? So given this GAN, we can now sample from its distribution. It'll produce a set of synthetic images that look similar to our real world distribution. And given this classifier for whether somebody's wearing glasses or not, again, trained on real world data, perhaps you separate your training set into the set that's used to train the GAN and set that's used to train the glasses classifier. Right, so you have this classifier trained that allows you to then label the synthetic images as whether they contain glasses or not. And in turn, this allows you to then label samples in your latent space with whether they are generating images that contain glasses or generating images that do not contain glasses. This then allows us to train a glasses classifier in the latent space, right? So now in this latent space where we can sort of freely manipulate and generate samples that we need, we have a sense of sort of which ones are likely to correspond to images with glasses, which ones are likely to correspond to images without glasses. And this was observed in work last year, I guess it's now 2 years ago, by Emily Denton et al., that says that the latent space of GANs can actually, you can do this, and in particular, you can do this with linear classifiers in the latent space, and this works sort of surprisingly well. And so they do this for analyzing GANs, but we actually are using this for a different purpose of actually generating the kind of data set that we want. So now, given at any particular point in this latent space, and the corresponding image that it would generate, we can hope to move, we know what direction to sort of move in to hopefully, progressively add glasses to this image. And so when we do that, what do we see? So in fact, as we're progressing from this image in the direction of adding more glasses, we are in fact adding glasses, but of course we're changing other things, including we're adding hats. Why? Well, of course, because the original real-world data set is biased. So, of course, the underlying latent representation is biased. And, of course, the glasses classifier is biased in this exact way that it's correlating glasses with hats. So what do we want to do? So the original, we have this protected attribute hyperplane for has glasses. We can also use the, again, sort of the same process we train on real world data projected to the latent space. We can have a target hyperplane for whether the image is likely to have a hat or not. And so now this helps us define a new direction to move into. So we can hopefully be moving sort of parallel to the has hat hyperplane, which, at least in theory, should be adding glasses still, because we're still moving in the direction of adding glasses, but wouldn't add a hat, because our score for whether this image is likely to have a hat or not is staying the same because we're moving parallel. And so this is inspired by some work that I actually already mentioned for the mitigating biases with adversarial learning. So this kind of idea of gradient projections. But again, they're using this for adversarial training, whereas we're using this for data generation. And so when we move in this direction, right, so we actually see exactly what we want to see. So this is an image that's where we're progressively adding glasses, but we are not adding hats. And so this then allows us to do this kind of paired augmentation where we start with any point Z in the space, and we can sort of sample from this distribution that was given to us. We start with any point Z, and we can produce a point Z prime that has sort of the inverse score of glasses. If Z had glasses before, it now doesn't have glasses. If it didn't have glasses before, it now does, and has sort of the same amount of hats. So if it didn't have a hat before, it's likely not going to have a hat. And if it did have a hat, it's going to still have a hat. Right, and because all of these are linear, there's actually a nice closed form solution for this that makes it simpler to do in practice. So this is a good time to pause and sort of reflect on this method. So what are the pros here for doing this kind of data generation? So the pros are, first of all, that this is a single GAN that can be used for multiple target and protected attributes. So we train one GAN on the entire data set, and then we can apply this method to sort of generate data that debiases multiple and decorrelates multiple attributes. Because we're sampling Z's from the original latent space, this preserves intra-class variation. So at least in theory, right, the sample of Z's reflects the diversity of the real world data. And so then it's just kind of like for every point from that sample, we're also creating a pair without disrupting the underlying diversity. By construction, it ensures independence between attributes in the generated data, and it can be generalized to multiple protected attributes. So I'm sure one of the things you noticed about these generated images, right, is that it did, change the glasses. It did preserve not having a hat, but it also appears to have changed the gender expression. And so if this is something that's an issue, if this is something you want to mitigate, there's actually, we show in the paper that you can, add multiple protected attributes. So it doesn't have to just be this glasses. It could also be gender. It could also be something else. So what are the cons? I mean, the classifiers need to be at least reasonable, right? So this is all dependent on the original real world classifier being reasonable and reasonably able to predict these attributes, even if with some existing correlations, but at least sort of well enough to be able to do this. Might add other correlations. So even if you, add a second protected attribute or a third protected attribute, that doesn't mean that it's not going to generate, extra correlations with a fourth attribute or with something else that's not been annotated in the data set. And of course, GANs are tricky, right? So they're both tricky to train, but also, I think despite a lot of the hype around them, they do struggle with generating, out of distribution examples. And to some extent, that's sort of what we're asking to do here. So I'm going to talk very quickly through actually evaluating these classifiers. And so this is, once we've generated the data, we're now training attribute classifiers on this debiased data set and going to evaluate them. The setup is to lab a data set, so the same face images, we're trying to predict attributes. So the protected attribute is gender, and the target attributes are 26 other face attributes. So for example, has hat, has sunglasses, those are the target attributes we're trying to predict. I'm going to throw a bunch of tables up. Apologize, don't have the time to go into details, but I'll give you kind of the big takeaways. So compared to the baseline, much better on 3 fairness metrics. So the fairness metrics in this case are difference in equality of opportunity, bias amplification, which is the A, and then KL is the KL divergence in the scores between the scores predicted for male and female images for this attribute. And so as expected, sort of training with this kind of biased data performs consistently better than baseline. Comparing this to weighted, which is what I called oversampling last time, and adversarial, so generally better than adversarial, exactly as we would expect. Generally not as good as weighted. So again, we've noticed on this data set, weighted performs quite well. So we're not as good as weighted, although won't go into this too much here, but weighted actually strongly amplifies bias in the negative direction. So it sort of very strongly learns to decorrelate, hats and sunglasses. And so it actually harms it on overall accuracy pretty substantially. So if you care about fairness, but also with accuracy, weighted really does not strike a good trade-off there. We can compare this to domain independent. So remember, I mentioned the domain independent model is better when skew is low, is better when skew is high, right? And so here we see this, we're definitely better when skew. So skew, right, is correlation between target and protected attributes. So we're better when skew is low, but then domain independent still remains the best when skew is high. So this is basically we're separating our 26 attributes into low skew and high skew ones. And so finally, compared to other prior work, like for example, fairness GAN, we are here comparing against them on the metrics that they're reporting, and we're sort of consistently better. All right, so this concludes the technical deep dive into into this line of work. And there's one more, before I conclude, there's sort of one more thing, and Nick already alluded to this in the introduction, is I do want to mention that this is not the full cycle. We've looked at the cycle, but so far we've only looked at the data and the pathway from data into the models. But there's this whole other part of this, which is, thank you, Nick, for highlighting the slogan that AI will change the world, but who will change AI? So there's this question of, right, who is actually building these systems and who is making decisions about what data to collect, who's making decisions about what questions to ask about the data, who's making decisions about what applications to tackle, so sort of where to deploy AI next, and then who is deciding how to actually deploy and apply these systems ethically. And it should come as no surprise, right, that we have a very distinctive lack of diversity among AI researchers, even though these systems are being deployed and are affecting everybody. And so I'll just spend one slide, of course, talking about AI for All, which, as Nick mentioned, is a nonprofit dedicated to increasing diversity and inclusion in AI. And my all-time favorite quote from it was a student who attended AI for All, one of the AI for All programs in 2016, who said, "Until this program, I never thought that people who look like me could succeed in computer science and AI." And this is one of the key reasons why we do what we do. So our goal at AI for All is to educate and support a diverse next generation of AI leaders. We are not satisfied with just introducing students to AI and getting them excited. What we want to do is really support them through diversifying progressively higher and higher ladders of leadership within AI. So we want to see them go on and become, faculty at top institutions, to become CEOs of large companies, to become, CEOs of amazing, successful startups, to do excellent work in AI policy and sort of hold on to leadership positions there. And so there's a number of things we do sort of focused on that goal. We started at the high school level and sort of try to provide support for these students going forward. And so so far in the past 5 years or so, we've partnered with 16 universities to run summer programs for high school students from underrepresented groups. I'm providing the exact links here to read more about it. Of course, these summer programs, they're excellent and very sort of high touch points, but every university can support between 20 to 40 students per summer. Just sort of realistically, it's very logistically difficult to run these programs. And so we also recently launched a free online open learning platform, and this actually can be used by anybody, but it's particularly targeting high school teachers who want to bring some AI and AI literacy into the classroom, but may not be AI experts themselves. And so that's sort of to help them do that, and potentially to create a pipeline of students as well who might be interested in attending the summer programs after they get excited in the open learning sessions. And then the ultimate goal is to provide really lifelong training and mentorship and opportunities and community for our alumni. And so I will say that amazingly, many alumni have already taken on AI leadership roles of various kinds while still at high school and early college. And so many of them have started working on research projects. I actually had a student in my lab last summer who was a high school student who was doing an excellent project on GANs, by the way. Started working groups, panels, clubs, their own outreach events, and so on. And you're welcome to read a lot more about them. And so with that, I will bring it back to the amazing team of students that have contributed to this research that I've talked about here, either directly or indirectly. All of these students I've either talked about their work, or they're working on something really cool in this space that's about to go public shortly. And so I wanted to put them all here, and above all else, all of them have influenced the way I think about this work. And so they definitely deserve a shout out. In particular, Kai-Yu Yang, who's going to be on the faculty market shortly. Thank you. I am happy to take questions.
Thanks, Olga. Fantastic talk. Really appreciated that. I think Rob Mitchum is gonna drive our Q&A to make sure that order prevails. So Rob, I'll turn it over to you.
Nick, and thank you, Olga, for the great talk. My name's Rob Mitchum. I'm the Communications Director for the Center for Data and Computing. If you have a question, whether you're watching on YouTube or Zoom, just pop it in the chat, and I'll grab them out of the respective chats and pass them along here in the Q&A portion. So the first question we received is from Ebenezer Agbazo, who asks about the applicability in the medical field for the tools you talked about today.
Yeah, so I'm not an expert in the medical domain. I think a lot of these kinds of issues arise, particularly the data bias, I think is very, very prominent in the medical domain. And I know about this because we taught this at Princeton AI for All last summer in great detail, the sort of lack of racial diversity in particular in the kind of data that goes into medical data sets. And so, for example, we looked at melanoma detection and the data set that had mostly light-skinned individuals, which means that, the kind of computer vision models that were developed to do melanoma detection there really only worked on light skin. And, that is obviously a huge problem. And so these kinds of data set bias issues are very relevant. In terms of the AI models, I mean, there's definitely a need for solutions. I think the type of models that are being used, I mean, there's sort of medical applications operating on images, in which case this is perhaps relevant, although, we would want to make sure that, ultimately, just like here, we want to validate this on real images and make sure that this is kind of performing the way we would expect it to perform on real and not just generated data. But there's also a variety. I mean, machine learning fairness is a very, very broad space, far broader than just computer vision. So there's for sure lots of applications to medical data and other kinds of data as well.
Thank you. So Grace Sue asks, what open problems remain in addressing bias in artificial intelligence, in your view?
Everything is an open problem. I think, we've really started talking about this quite recently, all things considered. This is really when AI systems became deployed, when it started working, right? So computer vision, 10 years ago, just wasn't working super well. And so it just wasn't really deployed in any sort of, anywhere comparable to the scale at which it's deployed now. And so, we're really, the Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency Conference that started in 2018. Before that, this was, sort of part of the machine learning, it was like a workshop in the machine learning community that we were sort of sharing information in. Now this is a whole new conference. Everything is still unaddressed, right? So any part of this cycle, and then again, this cycle is a simplification, any part of this has open problems, right? So how do we think about different types of data collection, right? So right now we're relying on image search engines. Are there better ways to get data? Are there better privacy-aware ways to get data? Is there better ways to get consent from people before collecting this data? Transparency of data, increasing representation in the data from people of different countries, from people who may not be uploading their photos from the web. How do we make sure they're represented? Everything within AI models. So all kinds of problems with how you actually train from it. So long tail distribution, learning with constraints, interpretability. And of course, how are these models used to make decisions? What kind of safeguards can we put in place when deploying these systems? Again, issues of diversity. How do we get a more diverse population? In particular, sort of diversifying the top is a really tricky bit. How do we actually put more diverse thinkers into the higher leadership positions? I mean, all of this is an open question.
Great. Kevin Yao asks, is there any systematic way to detect spurious correlation in the data set, such as glasses versus hat in your example?
Well, so I think Revise is part of that, which sort of tries to detect what it can in terms of spurious correlations that may have some kind of meaning. Of course, when you're talking about visual data, every image is unique and every image is worth 1,000 words, right? So there's going to be all kinds of spurious correlations. So now the question is, how do you sort of regularize the search space and what kinds of things do you want to look for? even there, you're ultimately going to need a human in the loop to make decisions about what is, an innocuous correlation versus what is potentially a problematic one. And so, Revise is our kind of best attempt at starting to answer that question with visual data. But yeah, I think that's sort of where we are.
Right. So Chimalbi, who is one of the students from our CDAC Summer Lab program, he asks, race and ethnicity is a problem in fairness in AI. Could and should ethnicity be changed with GAN? Even if the skin tone could be changed, could facial features be tweaked as well?
That is an excellent question. And so when we started this, GAN, yeah. So can, yes, it can. Should, deeper question. So when we started this GAN project, so we're showing experiments here on gender, partially because this data set had publicly available gender annotations, but we've it would be fairly straightforward based on other literature that shows it would be fairly straightforward to apply it to race. So we've spent a lot of time. This was led by PhD students of Vikram Ramaswamy, as well as Sunny Kim. And so we've spent a lot of time with them talking about what it means to do this kind of manipulation of protected attributes with a GAN. And where we landed is the following. So we are doing this to then train a downstream model. So the way we want to think about these images is that they are an internal representation of that's then used for downstream. So they're kind of an internal representation that happens to be interpretable to us. So there's an extra danger, for example, showing these images, which is why you notice, like in this talk, at no point do I show sort of gender manipulation of the GAN, and I wouldn't show that with race either. And in fact, we struggle, this is under review, we struggle with this. So in the main paper, we do not, this is also an archive. So at no point there do we actually show these images. So we show these examples with sunglasses and with hats. In the review version of the paper that's under peer review, in the supplementary material, we show, a figure for the reviewers, but we make it clear that we're going to take it out, and we've taken it out for the public version. And so, should it be? I think where we've landed is that the real danger is if these images get shown. But if sort of nobody's looking at them, then we can treat this the same way we would treat any kind of like internal representation of the CNN. And yeah, it just happens to be one that's interpretable to us. But yeah, it's a great question. We've had lots and lots and lots of conversations about this.
Excellent. And for our final question, I'm going to throw it over to Nick, and he'll wrap us up.
Great. I'll field my own question from the chat. Olga, I asked, the really interesting work on detecting the spurious correlations, and another area that I think we hear a lot about are things like proxy variables and things where the model might learn something from a combination of variables. And so I'm wondering if your techniques to detect spurious correlations in features that exist in your data set, is there any way to apply this techniques to discover that maybe you have that something in your model correlates with something that might not be in the trained model but might exist in the real world?
Yeah, so I think the still the problem here is that this is so most of these are not. Revise is about sort of detecting spurious correlation. The AI model bits is about like mitigating them, given that you have these annotations already available. So this is sort of your kind of. You can look at the co-occurrences of labels in your training set, and you can see that there's these correlations, and you can then specifically sort of target them in your mitigation efforts. Generally, I get this question a lot about, can it automatically detect them? So I think the problem is if you don't regularize this in any way, if you set the model and you say, what is correlated with this, right? So this is, again, individual uninterpretable pixels. It can find any number of things. It can say that, the pixel, at coordinates 2,3, when it's, red, that correlates with whether there's, a hat in the image. And it's like, oh, okay, and it can spit out, millions of these kinds of correlations. And so, in order to produce correlations that are meaningful and that are sort of informative and that we would care about, I keep using this word regularize, like we want to somehow tell the classifier, okay, here are the kinds of things that I'm really looking for. So I'm really looking for correlations with objects, or correlation, correlations with, distance between objects, or correlations with scenes, and kind of give it a semantic vocabulary of things that would be important for us to realize and try to mitigate, right? Because these issues of bias and fairness, they're ultimately grounded in society, in particular societal constructs, right, that we've defined and that are important. And so, yes and no. So you can do more and more kind of automatic surfacing of them and automatic discovery, but ultimately, you do need some way of constraining this space. But last thing I'll say about it is certainly, I haven't talked about the work on interpretability of these models, but this is one of the things we're looking at is of course, this is a very active field of research, is, how do you actually understand what the model is learning, and then can you use that to backtrack into, studying bias propagation pathways and sort of better understanding this whole pipeline.
Super interesting. Thanks, Olga. We all really enjoyed the talk. I very much enjoyed it. I learned a lot, and just can't thank you enough for spending part of your afternoon with us.
Thanks so much for having me. This was great. I wish I could see all of you, but thank you so much for the questions and for having me and for engaging with these issues.
Definitely. Next time we'll have you back in a full auditorium, I hope. So
sounds excellent.
Yeah, hurry back. So thanks again. And I think just to close it out for the rest of the audience who's still here, Olga kicks off a great series that we have this spring in what we're calling bias correction, solutions for socially responsible data science. And Olga's talk, I thought, was spot on, right? I mean, these I think, as Olga pointed out, these issues of bias in machine learning are, they're a function of society and the data that exists in society. And I think it's incumbent on the designers of these tools and algorithms and models to account for that, and also make some attempts to correct and have some positive influence on the algorithms that are ultimately deployed and used in practice. So thank you, Olga, for giving us the first example of such a great positive example. Next, in about a week, we have Mukund Sundararajan, I practice this, I swear, Sundararajan from Google. And I encourage you to check out his bio and abstract as they are in Limerick. And I think the bio might be an iambic pentameter or something. So I'm not going to say more about Mukund. So you should go read his bio and abstract. And we'll see if you'll have to show up in person to see if the whole talk is in verse. I have high hopes. But in any case, we'll hopefully see you soon. And thanks again. Oh, and then I think finally, just a few more things to point out. Particularly, some of them are timely. I will point out that particularly for undergrads and high school students, our data and computing summer lab applications are open. There's a virtual information session later this week. That's your opportunity to do cool data science research projects with UChicago faculty members. The program's just a ton of fun, really fun, large cohort, very diverse cohort of people from around the country, both here in Chicago in our backyard as well as around the country. Then our data science and applied AI postdoctoral scholars program, the deadline is coming up for For those of you who are PhD students here or postdocs here, you probably don't need to know about this, but tell your friends to apply. And for those faculty who are here, of course, like we are continually looking to broaden the umbrella of mentors. And then finally, keep your eyes peeled for the machine learning for cybersecurity certificate that we are launching this spring. That's essentially an NSF-funded cybersecurity education project with myself and 2 other PIs in the department who are developing an online course sequence to upskill mid-career cybersecurity professionals to teach them a little bit more about machine learning and how to apply it in the security sphere. So, and then of course you can find this online at all these lovely places. We haven't been deplatformed yet, so we're still on Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, GitHub. Should mention that too. Keep your eyes peeled on GitHub too, because there's new fun open source efforts that are already being developed, and I'm sure you'll hear more about as the term rolls on. So thanks again, Olga, and thanks to everybody for attending.
Thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye.